Please give a warm welcome to Mike of Creativity.
What's up, what's up, what's up? Thank you, brother. All right, how are you guys doing today? How you feeling today? You feel like being a little uncomfortable today? Well, you really don't have a choice in that. I'm gonna make you uncomfortable a little bit because that's gonna be my job today. I'm gonna push you, I'm gonna involve you. So what I'm gonna start you out with is a little call and response, all right? Hip hop is rooted in call and response, and I'm gonna connect it to what I'm talking about here in just a second. So I'm gonna start off with I am somebody. Say I am somebody. Say peace. Love. Unity. And having fun. Say peace. Love. Unity. And having fun. I'm gonna cut you there. I'm gonna cut you there. All right. The reason that I go in starting first talking about I am somebody, right? And peace, love, unity, and having fun. There's a quote from a gentleman, his name is Cornel West. Anybody raise their hands familiar with Cornel West? If you're not, educate yourself on him, look him up. He's a great speaker, he's an activist, he's a college professor. He's taught around the country, around the world actually. And one of the things that he says is justice looks like love in public. Justice looks like love in public. That's a powerful statement. And the reason why it's a powerful statement, because often when we think about justice, we rarely think about empathy and we rarely think about love, right? We think about the right and the wrong thing a lot of the time when we think about justice. One of the things about hip hop and where it comes from and where it was created, is created out of nothing. It was created out of nothing in an impoverished environment in New York. And the ingenuity of these young people they were able to create a new reality out of their impoverished environment and where they were at. So when you think about New York in the 1970s, most of the kids at that time were engaging in gangs. And one of the things that were happening with the gangs in that environment was they were at war over territory. And there was two gentlemen in New York. One of them, African Bambaataa, and another one, his name was Kool Herc. Kool Herc was from Jamaica. And what they did was, in order to start shifting the narrative of the violence that was happening in that community, they started creatively engaging within the community. And the ways that they did that was they started throwing parties, right? They started throwing these hip hop parties where they were exchanging creative dialogue, and instead of the violence that was happening in the community during that time, they came up with creative ways in engaging with the violence. So instead of fighting someone, there was b-boy battles, and a b-boy is a breakdancer, somebody up there, getting down, b-boy stance. And what they were doing, if you ever watch breakdancers and the ways that they breakdance, a lot of their hand gestures and the things that they do, it looks like they're fighting. It's almost like capoeira. If you ever seen capoeira, it's like dance fighting. Instead of arguing, instead of fighting with their words and arguing, they started rapping. And they utilized verbal speech and poetry as a way to combat one another from different neighborhoods. So all of the elements and where hip hop comes from, it comes from a place of healing, and it comes from a place of progression and exchange within that healing. So there's a few things. Me, myself, I'm a hip hop artist. I'm also an educator, and I'm also a creator in a variety of different levels. So one of the things that I learned to do is to express my pain and my hurt through my art and my creativity. It was a release for me. And most of the words that I ended up connecting within that were things that were already hidden inside me, but I had to find a way to get those words out. And one thing that we do as artists and creators is the things that we go through emotionally are things that another person connects to. And the reason why other people connect to it, because that's the human in us. That's the humanity in us. And when we're talking about some of the pain and the things that we go through on a regular basis, those are the things that connects another person to perspective. Most people don't have any realization of another person's experience because they've never been in that person's environment. So it's really easy to be judgmental on another person's experience if you've never been in that environment, if you don't know what that person is going through. right? An example, I'm a dad, and I have 2 kids. I have a 3-year-old and I have an 11-year-old. One day, 5 o'clock, about 6 o'clock, I'm chilling in my room, watching television, and my 3-year-old runs into my room, and she tells me, Sissy won't let me watch Boss Baby. She's angry. And I'm like, what do you want me to do? As a dad, I'm a judge, right? I'm sitting here, I have to delegate. I have to make sure that everybody in this situation's voice is heard and that they're respected. And that neither one of them feel too marginalized within that experience. I also know that my 11-year-old remembers the promise that I made her. And the promise that I made her is if you finish your homework, you can watch Powerpuff Girls. Now, because of their age difference, they have very different tastes in what they want to watch. My 11-year-old is not into Boss Baby. That's not her thing. In fact, it triggers her a little bit because this little person is out here shouting orders to her on a regular basis. So my job as a dad is to look at the situation and understand both perspectives and understand both people, right? So within that situation, I know that my 3-year-old, she's cute, she cries a lot, and I don't want to have to deal with her too much other than just giving her some direction, all right? I know that my 11-year-old, she has to deal with this little person on a regular basis. She often gets things taken away from her, and I have to make a decision. Is this going to be another thing that I'm going to take away from my kid, my 11-year-old? So within that situation, I'm looking at the whole situation. I understand that this 3-year-old is still developing. She doesn't understand life. She has a perspective that is very selfish because she's inside of herself and she hasn't experienced too much life. So as a dad, I'm constantly looking at the situations like, this is my opportunity to teach her how to be just, how to be fair. Some of the words that are associated with justice, right? Fair-handedness, equity, equality, right? These are things that we expect from one another when we engage with one another on a regular basis, right? These are things that we need from one another to make sure that our boundaries are safe and that somebody's not overstepping those boundaries. Because once somebody oversteps that boundary, then it becomes a question of your own security. And that's when the question of justice starts really raising up, is when somebody feels like they've been violated, right? So within that situation, it makes me kind of reflect and really thinking about when we learn justice and where justice comes from, right? Justice isn't a new idea to us. As we grow up as people, we're constantly dealing with justice as little kids, whether we're on the playground, right? Whether we're playing sports, when we're in the school and we're dealing with the teacher. Teachers are having to know how to deal with justice on some form, in some level. So the idea of justice is really getting people to think around the idea of empathy, right? And sometimes that's a hard thing for a lot of people to even have, especially if you feel like you've been violated and your heart is hard towards another person's perspective. Equality, equity, all these different ideas. And my first experience myself dealing with these ideas came in a variety of different ways. One of the first times I can really remember dealing with justice in the household is with my dad, right? My dad was an issuer of justice a lot of the times. I would get in trouble. And that's actually how I became a hip hop artist, because I would get in trouble so much, I would get grounded, I wouldn't have television, I couldn't talk on the phone. So like, the only things that I had really to turn to was music. So I started producing, I started writing, and that became a relief for me when I was in trouble. But really thinking about the things that I gained from that, you know? There's a variety of things that I lost too. I lost friendships and connections and people that I cared about. But within that space, it gave me a release in being able to connect to myself and kind of evaluate where I am within the situation that I got myself into at that point. And there's a variety of different lessons that I learned as I was growing up about justice. Another lesson that I learned was when I turned 16. And when I was 16 years old, I could remember driving in my brand new Chevy Blazer. And I'm from a culture of low-riding culture, hip-hop culture, definitely. And I didn't grow up in an impoverished environment. My dad was in the military. He was an air traffic controller. I traveled a lot and seen a lot of different things. I gravitated towards hip-hop culture because that was something that I loved. So some of the things in hip-hop culture I was attracted to. So one of the things I was attracted to was lowriders. I used to have a truck. It was a lowrider, had rims on it. And as soon as I bought it, my parents were like, I hope you're expecting to get pulled over quite a bit driving in that car. And I was like, no, I'm not gonna get pulled over driving in this. I'm a good person, I'm not doing anything wrong. But I started realizing that perception is a powerful thing, right? And now that I'm actually somebody who works with officers on a regular basis, I do implicit bias workshops, I do adolescent development workshops, I do emotional intelligence workshops with officers and teachers and educators on a variety of different levels. And one of the things that I have learned is the power of condition. When somebody is conditioned in a way that they only see things in a certain light, that's a dangerous person if they don't have an outside perspective. And the outside perspective that we're all looking for when we're thinking about justice is not looking at a person as somebody outside of us, but somebody who's a reflection of us. Because when we're thinking of justice, justice deals with somebody who is you outside of you, though. And that's a complex narrative to really kind of dive into. But if we looked at everybody, back to what Cornel West said, justice looks like love in public. So if you're loving yourself and you're caring for yourself and who you are and where you're at, then not just that, also reflecting back on some of these stories that I just told. I was talking about my upbringing and me raising up kids and me having to delegate and deal with justice in the household, but also having to deal with my dad who was giving me justice as a young person. That is a perspective of empathy. And the reason why I say that is because the experiences that I went through and having to deal with these different things gave me an understanding of what it is to go through those things. So one of the things that I really dive into when I'm dealing with officers and young people is a reflection of who I was within those situations. I facilitate implicit bias workshops, and I facilitate conversations between officers and young people, but also officers and community members. And most of the time when we walk into the room, we have officers in one corner of the room, and we usually have young people in another corner of the room. And both of them have ideas of one another and what they think of one another, right? Officers walk into the room and it's like, I got to deal with these kids. They probably don't like me. I'm not ready for this. And it's interesting to think that somebody who has power, right? Somebody who issues justice on a regular basis would have anxiety around being around a young person who really doesn't have that much power in the situation other than their judgment and the ways that they think about a person. That's the only power that a young person really has when dealing with an officer. But the reality of it is officers go into that situation having their own anxieties. And then flip that, right? We're dealing with young people. And some of the young people that I'm dealing with come from a variety of different backgrounds. Some of them come from higher income. A lot of them come from lower income. So the reality of what they're dealing with on a regular basis and the ways that they see officers, a lot of the time, is how they've seen them in their environment, how their parents had to deal with them, how their cousins had to deal with them. This is the reflection of how these young people see officers. So in the mind of a young person, the officer is very much an idea that they may never have engaged on a personal level, but that idea is something that scares them because of the things that they've seen in their environment. Now, most people in here maybe have never lived in an impoverished environment. So if you've never lived in an impoverished environment, it's hard for you to have a perspective of what a young person is going through and the ways that they view officers. Another thing that we don't have an understanding is in a lot of impoverished environments, when we're talking about gangs, gang violence. Now, gang violence is something that becomes a legacy in some families, meaning that grandpa was a gangbanger, mom and dad was a gangbanger, and then the little kid who's coming up has been exposed to this their whole lives. So in their mind, they're not thinking of this as a bad thing because that's how they came up. Right? If you came up around lions and you're used to having lions around you, then a lion isn't a scary thing because you're used to having lions in your environment. So these young people have seen their parents and they've seen their cousins and they've seen their aunts and uncles be marginalized by officers. So their views of this person is very much an idea. Now there's a difference between a generalization of a group of people versus a person as an individual. All of us represent generalizations. There's men in here who represent the generalization of men. Now, does that mean that every man in here is a patriarch or a misogynist? No. But it means that the generalization, the general idea of you may be that. Now, speaking to you as an individual breaks that down, meaning that you as an individual, you may not perpetuate these different ideas. It doesn't mean the generalization isn't true. It just means that you as an individual have challenged that narrative at this point, right? Same with officers. Right? So when we're thinking about officers, the generalization to an officer in communities that come from lower income is that this officer might be somebody that might hurt me. But after you talk to that person as an individual, that one person that you had in your group as an individual, and you've heard their experiences, the things that they've gone through, you have to look at that person now as an individual instead of a generalization. Now, it's a complex thing when we're talking about all of these layers of what it is to be just and unjust and what it looks like, because the reason that I go into this is because it becomes a perspective at that point. And one of the perspectives that I recently thought about and kind of dived into in the ways that it was perceived was Mike Tyson and Evander Holyfield fight. Does anybody remember that fight? The Mike Tyson and Evander Holyfield fight. So what Mike Tyson did was considered savage, right? He bit that dude's ear in the 90s. Some of y'all might be too young to remember that. Some of y'all may not even pay for pay-per-view to even engage in that. But one of the things about it was when you're watching the fight, the only thing that you see is Mike Tyson biting that person's ear, right? And then like later on, and let's give some context to it, right? Mike Tyson had been around a lot of pressure. He gotten beat up by Evander Holyfield once already. This is the second time that he was fighting him at this point. And people were already counting him out. People already thought he was gonna lose. So within that, he's already going into an intense environment with all these other things playing against his narrative and what that is. So within that fight, as he's fighting Evander Holyfield, he's saying that Evander Holyfield keeps coming up and headbutting him, hitting him in the eye, hitting him in the face with his big head. Evander Holyfield has a big head. So within these fights, if you're a boxer, you have a different perspective versus being the person who's watching it, right? As a person watching it, the only thing you notice is like, wow, that was savage. He just bit that dude's ear. As a boxer, somebody who's been in the ring and understands what it is to fight, somebody headbutting you is something that hurts bad and could cause you to be angry. I'm not gonna say it's gonna cause you to wanna bite someone's ear necessarily, but your frustration level is gonna be at a high peak. And you probably would only understand that if you've been in the ring before, if you fought before, right? Now, this is where it gets tricky. The referee is technically the judge in this situation, right? The referee, he keeps telling the ref, Mike Tyson is telling the ref, hey, he keeps headbutting me. Will you stop it? And the ref keeps breaking him up, pulling him back. And then what ends up happening? Mike Tyson decides to take justice in his own hands. He took justice in his own hands and he bit that man. He almost bit his ear off. I believe he had to get it sewn back on. That's how vicious it was. So the reason that I go into that is because it ties into justice in the sense of when somebody takes justice into their own hands. And when we're talking about somebody taking justice into their own hands, it becomes a very dangerous thing, right? It can become savage in a lot of ways, right? But it's on the system, right? The referee, the person in the middle, to make sure that everybody's respected in that situation. Everybody's voice is being heard and they're treated fairly within that situation, or it becomes a gruesome situation, like within that fight. So there's a variety of ways that we engage in justice. There's social justice, right? Social justice is equality for the people, making sure that everybody is heard, and then within that, we're respecting the oppressed, the people who have oppression over them. There's restorative justice, and that's a technique of restoring a community, right? Setting up an environment where everybody is feeling heard. That's one of the things that I engage in on a regular basis with officers and young people. We have restorative circles. Everybody is in a circle. You have a facilitator who isn't biased to either side or tries not to be biased to either side and allows everybody to kind of speak their truth. And from that truth, they have an understanding of one another and what their experiences may be a little bit, right? And, you know, there is self-justice, you know, justifying for yourself, speaking up for yourself, and then within that, making sure that you set boundaries so that people understand where you're at. Justice is a complex thing just because there's so many different approaches in making sure, and everybody's definition of it is so different. Everybody's definition is so different. That's one of the reasons why we deal with so much of what we deal with here in the States, in America, when we're talking about justice. Because so many people have different perceptions of what it is based off of their environment and the ways that they came up and the experiences that they had. So when we're talking about something as simple as like a Mike Tyson situation, we don't think about it as a justice situation, but it very much is. He felt violated. We may not agree with the ways that he handled it, but within the ways that he expressed his emotions within that, you can very much tell that Mike Tyson felt like he was violated. Now, Evander Holyfield is a whole nother story, right? Evander Holyfield, in the style and the ways that he fought, he felt like he was violated. He had his ear bit off, you know? And that's injustice in his whole body, in the ways that he was engaging within that. So like when you're thinking about Evander Holyfield and his experience, we can't discount that, right? He ended up later suing Mike Tyson in that fight and charging him with, I believe he charged him with assault. Yeah, he charged him with assault within that situation, which was just. So, I mean, my experiences with justice growing up and dealing with the experiences that I dealt with, being racially profiled, being marginalized because I was young and sometimes in the wrong environment, I had to learn how to engage in a way that didn't marginalize me and that the officer knew that I needed respect and vice versa. I gave him respect. And it's a tricky game because that's where the gate of justice begins. Most of the time we look at officers as people who are the ones who are the judge and jury. And a lot of the time they're the ones who are the gatekeepers. And dealing with a situation that's hard and how you deal with that officer escalates it for a lot of young people. That's one of the lessons that I try to teach young people as they're going into the world and they're dealing with officers on a regular basis. It's like, I know right now you're not wanting to be open-hearted and like, you know, be respectful in the ways that you engage with an officer. But a lot of the time that's gonna be the depicting thing on how the DA and the judge deal with you. So how do these ideas like connect into creativity and the layers of what creativity is? I think justice is an important thing to think as a creator. And the reason why I say that is because we're all reflections of one another. So if you're a creator and you're somebody who puts those creations out for other people to experience, whether it be through advertisement, whether it be through making an app, all of these different things. Recently, I was involved with working with RTD and the marketing team with RTD doing an implicit bias workshop. And the reason why I was working with them is because they wanted to be conscious of the ways that they engaged communities of color. And the reason why they wanted to be conscious of it because they had some pushback in some of the advertisement that they had done in previous advertisements. So they were trying to be cognizant in the ways that they put together this plan that they were putting together. One of the things that ended up happening, and it's true for everybody, is everybody has bias. And as a person who is a creator, sometimes that bias can go into your creations, not even knowing it. So being aware of the ways that you create and also keeping in mind that everybody is a person, everybody is a human being, regardless of the skin color and the ways that we look at one another, we're reflections of one another. And if we thought about ourselves as reflections of one another, we may have a little bit more empathy in the ways that we engage on a regular basis, in the ways that we see each other on the news. Empathy is an important thing. The three things that I feel that could change us and transform us are simple but complex. I feel like if we had more empathy in our justice system, if we had more love in our justice system, and more open-mindedness, love, empathy, and open-mindedness, we would be able to evolve our system. But we're all stuck in these echo chambers of our own realities, and we accept these echo chambers as absolute truth. And the thing about the internet, there is no absolute truth on the internet. There is no absolute truth when we're talking about politics, right or left. There's no absolute truth. There's a lot of gray area. And most of us are scared of the gray area because the gray area isn't comfortable. The gray area isn't your absolute truth. The gray area isn't right or wrong. But when you find yourself in the gray area, that's where you find the most unique, creative ways in engaging in hard issues and problems. When we're talking about our justice system, we have to engage it in the gray area, taking everybody into consideration and how they're affected, because not everybody on this plane is equal. There's a lot of inequality when we're talking about justice and the ways that it's issued. And we've noticed it within the changing of the laws that have happened within cannabis. We've noticed it within the changes in the laws that have happened within the ways that we've imprisoned people over generations. And the thing that we have to be cognizant of is that depending on the environment and the reality that a person is dealing with on a regular basis, some people are just trying to survive. And if those people are trying to survive, should we put a thumb on them to keep them down further? You know? So these are complex questions that I don't have the answer to. But if everybody in here was open-minded, had empathy, right, and loved each other a little bit more, it would be a different thing that we're engaging on a regular basis when we're talking about justice. So as we kind of approach this 2020, because that's where we're at right now, right? We're 2019, 2020 is the 21st century, meaning that we're 21 years or 20 years into the 21st century. Meaning that the 1900s, the 20th century, those were old ideas. When you look at 20 years into any decade or any century, there we go, thank you. When you look 20 years to any century, there's always a renaissance. And the reason why it's a renaissance within the 20 years is because there's new technology, there's new ideas that are being pushed forward, and you have to be able to shed off these old ideas in order to embrace these new ideas, which is scary. It's the scariest thing for most people, especially like my kids. I have an 11-year-old and a 3-year-old. They have no idea of what it was like in 1990s. They have no idea. So their whole reality will be a 21st century reality in the ways that they engage. Us, because we have this bridge of understanding what it was like in the 1990s versus where we're at in the 21st century, we're dealing with knowing what we came through and knowing where we're currently at and scared about where we're going. That's the reality of where we're at. So like the only things that we can really do is embrace where we're currently at right now, in the moment, and look at one another to evolve these new ideas, trust in one another. And the only way I feel that we can do that is to have conversation, hard dialogues about the things that we've gone through in the past. Me as an artist, I use my creativity to express my emotion and to give perspective to those who listen to it. And I want to share some words with y'all. The words that I want to share is something that I wrote in reference to justice. I have 2 poems. Do you mind if I share those poems with you? Cool. Thank you. All right. This first one that I'm sharing with you is based off, well, before I go into this one, how many of y'all did the writing prompt that was here? Anybody? Yeah, a couple of people. The writing prompt? Justice sounds, taste, all those things? Yeah? All right. Do you mind sharing some of the things that you may have wrote? What does justice sound like to you if anybody wrote off of that? Can somebody share real quick? A hallelujah chorus. That's beautiful. Thank you. What's another thing that you wrote that connected to justice in the ways that you wrote it in the writing prompt? Possible for many. Impossible for many. Thank you. What are some other answers that came up from what you wrote in the writing prompt? Say it again. One more time. Balance. Yes. Right? When we're talking about balance, we're talking about the Lady of Justice. You know, one story, since you brought that up, going back to balance, when we think about Egyptian culture, right, and we think about Ma'at and the Egyptian afterlife, she would take one of her feathers and weigh it against your heart. And if your heart was heavier than the feather, then you wouldn't be able to pass on to the afterlife, right? What that really is talking about is the burdens that we carry on our hearts, right? So like, even if somebody else forgives you, if you don't forgive yourself, then that weight will keep you from evolving into your next. So with that being said, I'm gonna share this poem. I wrote this for this specifically, and I have another piece that I'm gonna share with you as well. But it's engaging the prompt that you did. Justice sounds like the rhythm of life, the heartbeat of evolution. Justice sings a sound like a control over broken barriers. Justice is the heartbroken reality of an unjust casualty yelling, please take care of us. We've been asking for dreams to become visions, visions to become insight, insight to the light of hidden path, standing for the ones, twos and threes that never one could be seen. Most too blinded by the light, or have a short insight, or claim to be intelligent but entail nothing bright. Ability to set flight at new heights is what we strive for. Love is a work for peace, not another chore. We store data in ourselves to tell of a new future. Love is the backbone of the foundation for a home. The reflection of another means none of us alone. The reflection of another means none of us alone. The reflection of justice means you and me are one. Thank you. And I'm gonna share this last piece with you. This is an actual song that I wrote, but I do it as a spoken word piece. It's called Hold On. A young man with plans to expand a lost foundation. Graffiti hieroglyphics, lost words in translation. Only thing he relates is rhyme pens in a pad, dissect, chop up, recreate, beats in a lab. He speaks of evolution, saw his brother beat in the streets, decided the only way to beat the streets is to speak over beats. Wanted to free his mind at the same time, and so too. Found a woman, wrapped herself up in righteous virtue. Poetic elegance, she spoke without saying a word and gave confidence in the soul of this hip-hop nerd. With the strength of 10 men, new breath in his lungs, decided to start a revolution with love and no guns. At 23, he had the heart of Huey P. Wanted to redefine the definition to be free. Found himself in his ancestors' history. A young man trying to find his American me. New creation, new thoughts to define his mind. A rolling stone in his hands, he held time. Search for the light. In the midst of dark, search for the shine. Broke bones and broke spirit, but he kept trying, refused to die. He held some scriptures in his heart. The evolution's all my love, you can't tear it apart. I had the blood of Nat Turner and Asada Shakur, so when you beat me to the ground, it makes me want to fight more, so taste the truth. Let the truth roll from your tongue. Let the truth be a spark for an evolution, for the soul and mind, like Christ giving sight to the blind. And it all started with him just renewing his mind, while we hold on, keep strong, make it through the fire of the pain, have strength to maintain a new day. Everything's gonna be okay. Thank y'all. Thank you. And bring it back around. Thinking about my daughters and the television and the situation of them fighting over the television and what they were gonna watch. One thing about being the oldest is you understand sometimes you have to give things up, right? And within the situation with my daughters, I try to explain to my daughter, because I'm the oldest sibling in my family, and I got a lot of things taken away from me as I was growing up, because I had to give it up to my younger siblings because they needed it a little bit more than I did. But that's not what I did in this situation. I made my youngest daughter wait until my oldest daughter was finished watching Powerpuff Girls. And then once she was done watching Powerpuff Girls, I gave her an opportunity to go ahead and talk with her sister about them negotiating some time on watching Boss Baby. Now, I try to instill in my kids to communicate with one another, to have conversations with one another, and to understand one another's perspectives. I try to teach my oldest daughter that this 3-year-old doesn't know anything yet. She's still learning, she's still figuring it out. And I think that it's an important thing as somebody who has power or somebody who has influence to understand what that power and that influence can do to another person. It's real easy to be reckless with that. And as long as we understand that people are people, we have feelings, we have emotions, and we think with our heart instead of just thinking with our head, because it's real easy to think about the particulars with your head. Sometimes it's hard to understand another person's perspective. So as creators, I think it's an important thing as creators to create from the heart. And sometimes we're getting contracts, right? Sometimes there's deadlines. Sometimes it is what it is within the business that we deal with. It's not always a heartfelt thing, right? But like within the situations where you do have opportunities to express it with your heart and to like give a perspective within what you do as a creator, I think thinking about everybody and making sure that it's an inclusive image or an inclusive creation for everybody is a key thing as being a creator, because we have so much power in the ways that we influence the world. All of us do. All of us do. Whether you're creating videos and editing, or you're making music, or you're doing audio production, or whatever what your style of creation is, all of us have power in the ways that we influence one another. So I encourage you to be somebody who is empathetic, open-minded, and create with love. Thank you.